Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our joint discussion of the American Revolution, right? So today in class, we both left off talking about some really important stuff, right? We were discussing and analyzing what's going on in Europe during the 17 and 1800s, right? We got high economics, we got colonies everywhere, and we have really strong governments in control, right? Mostly absolutist governments in Western Europe, and then you have, of course, Britain with your constitutional government and things like that. And we also have mercantilist economic policies all over the place that are making these new governments a lot of money. Problem is, though, these new governments are going to go to war with each other, causing massive amounts of debt, and they're going to, of course, seek to get their money back for their debt where? From their people, through the forms of taxation and also aggressive economic and political measures, right? This is going to help lead to what's known as revolutions, right? So we started talking about this in class today, leading up to the revolutions that are going to happen during the 1700s, and we are going to spend some time in this class talking about two of them in particular, the American and the French, right? Now remember though, okay, we found out this in class recently, is that your 7th grade year was supposed to be the year that you learned about the American Revolution. That was the year that all of y'all had like COVID school and stuff like that. So we're going to pick up the pieces a little bit, but we're not going to dive too deep into this, okay? So what we're about to do right now is actually a crash course of the American Revolution. We're going to be talking about the top 10 events, okay? You don't need to write this down. You don't need to write this down. Alert, 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 alert. You don't need to write this down, okay? This is just like a table of contents. If you want to screenshot this and use it later for your study materials or something like that, just to know the top 10 events in order and how they progress and stuff like that about the American Revolution, you can totally do that. But we're going to just be doing a crash course in the American Revolution. Why are we only doing a crash course in the American Revolution? Due to the fact that you're going to be learning a lot about this next year, right, when you're in your U.S. history classes, okay? But we're going to talk about the American Revolution, trying to just in a quick surface area analysis thing to kind of just give us the broad-based thematic scheme of a revolution and what a revolution looks like, right? We're going to start off by talking about the Navigation Acts, talk about how mercantilism was angering a lot of the people in the colonies during this time period, and how that's going to kind of spiral out of control after a huge amount of debt. It's going to lead to a war, and you're going to end up having the American country that you know of today, the United States of America, after that American Revolution, right? But let's go ahead and not dawdle. Let's dive headfirst into this crash course, right? So the very first event we got to talk about is this thing known as the Navigation Acts, right? So some of y'all are going to be like, wow, Mr. Terry, you were moving really fast. Well, the thing about it is, y'all, it's a crash course, okay? It's not meant to be something that we sit here and marinate in for like 3 days, okay? And I also don't want this flip to be any longer than it absolutely has to be. So let's go ahead and start off with that first event, right? Very first event, we got the Navigation Acts, okay? Which is happening under the Commonwealth period in England, right? It's actually the 3rd year into the Commonwealth period, or second year, into the Commonwealth period, which lasted from 1649 to 1660. And of course, as you remember, who was the guy in charge of the Commonwealth? None other than Oliver Cromwell, the man that won the English Civil War against King Charles and led the Roundheads to victory and the parliamentarians. Well, the thing that we got to remember about Cromwell as well is that he was a borderline absolutist, very intense ruler, super aggressive, outlawed everything fun. And another big thing about him is he also adopted mercantilistic policies, right? So mercantilistic policies, of course, is what we remember from our last unit, is the idea that economics during the 1700s were guided and dictated by the idea of hoarding as much money as you possibly could inside your country and trying to prevent your people from trading with others, right? So it's like, okay, if you're English, you're only buying English goods. If you're Dutch, you're only buying Dutch goods. If you're French, you're only supposed to buy French goods, to keep the money cornered inside of the country, right? Well, Cromwell does this exactly like everybody else is doing because he is awful, and he signs a series of acts that actually even prevented as far as not just the people in England getting English goods, but even the American colonists were not allowed to buy goods from anybody that wasn't British. Now, this is going to be a really big deal because colonists were already getting goods cheaper from somebody else. They were getting goods cheaper from the Dutch, okay? This is going to anger them pretty significantly because that's not how it should happen or not how it should affect the colonists, right? The colonists are like, we live 2,000 miles away from you. Why are we worried about buying English goods and things like that and keeping your economy running when we got to worry about our own economy and things like that? We're very far apart. We're practically 2 different countries. So let us actually operate freely, right? So the Navigation Act is going to be probably one of the earliest things that helps lead to the American Revolution, and it started over 100 years before the Revolution ever even breaks out in 1651. Because the biggest reason why we talk about the Navigation Acts is it serves as an example, right? An example of mercantilistic colonialist policy that's happening in Great Britain during the 16 and 1700s, and how that's going to lead to some anger and resentment from the colonists against the British, because a lot of these Americans are like, why am I forced to buy your stuff if the Dutch will give it to me for significantly cheaper, right? So the thing about it is then time will progress forward. The Americans or the American colonists and stuff like that, who are still under the ownership of the British at this time, because of course, they're we're colonized by the British government. So the thing about it though is, as time rolls forward and things like that, we did talk about this in class, about 100 years later, a massive war is going to break out, right? About 100 years later, in the 1750s, a very large war known as the French and Indian War will break out, okay? And to add some insult to injury, not only are the American colonists already aggravated with Britain because they're forcing them to buy only British goods, well, the French and Indian War is going to send British debt sky high, right? The British defended the colonies in the French and Indian War. They came over with their military and stuff like that, fought against the French soldiers, fought against the Native Americans, and actually won that war for the colonists themselves. But the thing about it is it doubled the national debt in Britain from about 77 million pounds to 140 million pounds. By the way, a pound is a pound sterling. It's like the British form of currency. And the thing about it that you have to understand is, and how do you think the British is going to decide to get that money back? Well, they're going to do it quickly by issuing a ton of taxes, right? So the thing about it is that the British, okay, under this new government and stuff like that, even though they won the French and Indian War, it didn't really matter necessarily too much, because it still accrued them a massive amount of debt, doubling their national debt. And so a lot of the British were like, you know what, we'll get this money back by taxing the snot out of the colonists, right? And this is going to lead to a huge amount of anger and a huge amount of aggression from the colonists themselves. It's not going to go over very well. It's going to be one of the biggest leaders to this entire war. Now, so something that some of y'all apparently told me about in class recently is that a lot of y'all, when you were kids, when you were in elementary school, y'all talked about the American Revolution a little bit. Y'all might have paraded around your school with signs and said things like, no taxation without representation. Well, that all comes from one of the very first taxes that was actually passed by the British onto American colonies to get that money back for that French and Indian War debt, right? And the first act that actually comes to fruition is this thing known as the Stamp Act. And it'll actually run from about 1765 to about 1766, right? And it leads to that famous saying, no taxation without representation, okay? So what it is, okay, the Stamp Act is a massive tax on all printed materials, right? So every single thing that was printed that went to the colonies had to have a very specific stamp on it, a 1-pence stamp known as this stamp of the crown right here, okay? That meant that it had been stamped, it had been taxed appropriately by the British government, but what it was doing, and what y'all have to understand, some of you are like, 1 penny, that's not that much. Well, a penny during the 1760s is a very expensive tax on just something that is printed, right? And it's jacking up the price of almost everything, right? Because the Stamp Act was put onto letters, envelopes, printed materials, pamphlets, posters, newspapers, even decks of cards, right? Driving the cost of all these things up. These are also things that the American colonists needed. They still needed basic necessities, which is going to lead to a huge outlash. This is a political cartoon that actually came out following the Stamp Act, and it says, this is the place to affix this stamp, showing a skull and crossbones saying, Britain, you're killing the colonies. You're killing us because you're actually unfairly taxing us this very large amount, right? So this leads to some of the earliest opposition against the British government during the American Revolution. Also some early violence and the phrase, no taxation without representation. Now let's break down that phrase real quick. No taxation without representation refers to the idea that the American colonists are furious because they feel as though it's not fair that they're getting taxed because they don't have members of parliament. There's no one in parliament that is elected from the American colonies to give them any type of credence or give them any representation or to give them anything to actually debate these taxes that are coming down on the American colonies. So they said, you will not tax us without representation in parliament. So that led to the idea of no taxation without representation. And speaking of that violence and stuff that was going on, this led also to the abuse of tax collectors. These men right here actually is being seen that are forcing this feathered man to drink hot tea are these people known as the Sons of Liberty, right? And the Sons of Liberty was a small group of men that was started by these American colonists, and some of the earliest founding fathers were actually inside of the Sons of Liberty. They beat, abused, tarred, and feathered tax collectors as a form of protest, right? And some of the earliest violence of the American Revolution actually happened there. Well, the thing about it is after 1766 and after the Sons of Liberty get involved and after finally the Stamp Act gets repealed in 1766, the American colonies are not happy, right? They're still like, you should not be taxing us unfairly, because now what's going to happen is after the abuse of the tax collectors, the British government is going to begin to move troops into the American colonies to prevent any future revolts, right? And this led to a very famous event known as the Boston Massacre, right? Because as tensions were growing, one night in Boston, a little boy ran up to a British officer. And he starts poking him in the chest. He starts being like, you owe my master some money. Because he's not like a master like that. He was an apprentice. The little boy was an apprentice to a wig maker and stuff like that in Boston. And he was like, you, British soldier, right here, you. And he's poking that guy in the chest. He's like, you owe my guy some money. You're supposed to pay him for that wig that you bought from him on credit and stuff like that. Give me my money. Do what you're supposed to do. Just because you're British and I'm American doesn't mean you can do these things, right? Well, some British soldiers noticed the commotion that was going on and they gathered around the scene. But then that led to a bunch of American colonists showing up in the same square and then yelling at the British soldiers, being like, what are you going to do? Shoot the little boy? What are you going to do? You're going to freak out? You're going to like shoot us? And then out of nowhere, a snowball comes thrown, right? A snowball actually started this whole thing. And it actually hit one of the British officers, and they accidentally pulled the trigger, and they let their fire off, and they shot into the crowd, right? And at the Boston Massacre, you would think thousands died, but actually only 5 people died, right? And the very first man that actually died in the American Revolutionary process to spill his blood was actually a former slave and a black man who actually is by the name of Crispus Attucks, right? He was actually in the crowd at the Boston Massacre, and he was standing up for the rights of that boy and the rights of Americans and things like that, who actually was there, like, yeah, he was the very first person to spill his blood in, like, the entire thing. His name is Crispus Attucks. His name is, like, spelled Crispus, and then Atticus. All right, so like now, but the result of this, though, is why are we calling this a massacre when Crispus Attucks and 4 other people were the only ones killed at this massacre, right? We talked about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands died there. So why is this a massacre? Well, the biggest thing about it is propaganda. Publication, right? The American colonists start calling it a massacre because they want to actually cause tension and make the British look bad, right? And so now as we continue to go forward and stuff like that, then the British are going to start getting even more aggressive. And they're like, all right, fine, we're going to start really punishing these American colonists for a lot of the actions that they're doing. So one of the earliest ones that they actually, the new tax that they passed is a very famous tax known as the Tea Act, right? And the Tea Act is going to jack up the price on tea, okay? Like now, this is a big thing that we got to understand is by the 1770s, tea has become a very important commodity to American colonies and as well as to the British themselves, right? And so the Tea Act was a very, very heavy tax imposed onto the American colonists, causing the American colonists to only have to be able to, or only buy tea coming from the East India Company, the British East India Company, setting up a monopoly on that product, right? The problem was, again, is they were getting tea cheaper from the Dutch. Now, the tea wasn't as high quality and stuff like that, so actually it was, like, worth more to buy the, like, English tea, but the colonists are still like, look, but what if I have a bad month? I still want to be able to buy the cheap tea because, like, what if I don't have that kind of money? So what's going to happen is the Sons of Liberty are going to storm. Don't write this whole thing, too, if you know what actually happened. The Sons of Liberty are going to dress as Native Americans and storm their way onto several boats in the Boston Harbor. And they're going to throw that expensive East India Company tea into the water. A very, very big form of what? This is protest, right? This is active civil disobedience. This is the colonists saying, how dare you tax our products like this? How dare you come down on us? How dare you force us to pay for the debts of your country when we are 2,000 miles away from you, right? So as you can tell, tensions are growing and things are getting even more intense, right? Which led to the very first calling of a very important meeting. This thing known as the First Continental Congress, called by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and several other early founding fathers. They wanted to try and figure out a way to push back against the British, okay? Because what is going to end up happening right after the Boston Tea Party, the British lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the 1700s, that's worth in the millions, right? In products and tea and other goods that would have been taxed that would have made them an excessive amount of money. So the British try to punish the colonists by passing these things known as the Coercive Acts, which was a series of 4 different acts that were meant to be really, really brash and intense, and we're going to blockade the Boston Harbor until they got their money back and stuff like that. And we're supposed to be really aggressive. Well, the British called them the coercive acts. The Americans referred to them as the intolerable acts because they're like, how dare you? This is intolerable that you try to blockade our harbor. This is intolerable that you try to allow soldiers to just live in our homes or in abandoned houses in our cities and stuff like that just because they're British soldiers of your government, right? And so what's going to happen is the Continental Congress is called. And the Continental Congress is called, in Philadelphia. And they're actually going to have a massive meeting, and the result is that 12 colonies delegates, it's all going to go down in Philly, are going to agree to boycott British goods. They're like, look, they want to come after us and our wallets? Let's not give them a dime, right? And they're going to decide to stop buying British goods altogether, right? Well, what this is going to lead to, though, is the British have had enough. And this is in 1774. The British feel as though they have enough, and they show up and they start asking for, they're demanding their money to come back. They're demanding the colonists to lower this boycott. They're demanding all the founding fathers to show up and be tried and prosecuted. But what ends up going down is the British begin to march through the streets of two very famous cities known as Lexington and Concord, right? Lexington and Concord in 1775 are the very first shots of the American Revolution, known as literally the shot heard round the world, because the very first shots that came out of the guns at Lexington and Concord were supposed to have started the American Revolution, and were supposed to be this moment that the entire world was realizing that a small group of colonies was going to revolt against the strongest naval and military power in the world, the British. And it's so famous, there's a Schoolhouse Rock song about it.
In their tracks at the old North Bridge, we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shot heard around the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move.
I know, right? So exactly, right? And then, of course, you also know about the very famous shot heard around the world because it was at that moment in Lexington and Concord when the British landed to start the early engagements against the American militia. Then apparently Paul Revere rode around the city of Boston yelling, oh, the British are coming, even though he actually never said that. He didn't say the British are coming, he said the regulars are coming, because of course the British are coming. Who else is coming? The Swiss? Now the thing about it though in general is he rode that distance warning everyone to prepare themselves and to tell the men to get their weapons and to form the militia, right? And then the very big number 7 event is this very, very important pamphlet that came out right after Lexington and Concord and right after the earliest shots of the American Revolution go down. Now, this is still before the war is declared, right? This is just the first act of large-scale violence between the American militias and then also the British government, right? And a guy comes along, and you could consider him an Enlightenment writer, and is a man by the name of Thomas Paine, right? Thomas Paine comes along, and he writes a very famous pamphlet called Common Sense. And he said, to the inhabitants of the Americas, it is common sense. It is common sense that we separate from the British. It makes no point for us to be with them anymore. We identify as American people. They are British people. They are the British government. We are the Americans. And we should actually separate from them and revolutionize and form our own country. The result of this led to massive sensationalism and a huge amount of support, and Americans begin to enlist in the Continental Army en masse, and the Continental Army would be led by none other than George Washington, right? And then, of course, as well, militias and Minutemen begin to form groups in their villages and things like that, and everyone begins to prepare for war. And at that point, when the America feels like they've had enough and they're ready to go, they sign and create this thing known as the Declaration of Independence, right? In 1776, in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall, I've been there many, many times, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams wrote and revised the Declaration of Independence, which now the war is in full swing. The Second Continental Congress meets, and they adopt and sign this new document. And it formally declares war on the British by the American government, right? And in 1776, the war begins. And again, you don't have to write this entire thing. Just be like, oh, war is now in full swing. Second Continental Congress signs the document, formally declares war, right? So then going forward, you have to understand the Revolutionary War would break out. From 1775 to 1783, a very large-scale, very violent, very intense war that we almost lost multiple times broke out in the American colonies, right? It was very vicious, very aggressive, but in the long run, the Americans come out victorious. Led by George Washington, led by Minutemen and militias and active involvement from different villages, and also using guerrilla warfare tactics. Do me a favor really quick, underneath the Revolutionary War, right? Guerrilla warfare. We used guerrilla warfare tactics to actually win this because we used our home field advantage and we knew the terrain. Guerrilla, though, in this sense is spelled Guerrilla, okay? Guerrilla warfare is when you use the land to your advantage and you don't follow the rules of the British Army. You don't meet in a big field and just shoot at each other. You jump out of trees. You raid supply lines. You get aggressive, and you kind of cheat a little bit, right? And then after 1783, the British realize they've had enough, and there's no way they can do anything about it. And by now, the Treaty of Paris is signed, okay? In 1783, Benjamin Franklin goes all the way to France with a delegation of American founders, and they decide to end the war with Great Britain. And they sign the document known as Treaty of Paris, which makes the United States a completely autonomous country free of British rule. And this painting is the very famous painting of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. And that right there is Benjamin Franklin. Here are the American delegates. This is where the British delegates were supposed to sit, and apparently they were so angry and disgusted that they had lost the war that they got up during the middle of the painting and stormed off. So the painting was left completely unfinished, right? But that right there is a crash course of the American Revolution. I love it, and now we're going to start talking about the French Revolution in our next class. My favorite thing to talk about. I'll talk to y'all soon.